Back in December 2009, I was living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. It was a quiet neighborhood and I enjoyed the peace and solitude. My only companion was my dog, Max, a loyal German shepherd who had been with me for years. Max was my protector, my friend, had my comfort in the lonely evening. The nights that month were cold with frost clinging to the windows. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones. I often sat in the living room wrapped in a blanket watching TV to pass the time. Max had a habit of sleeping by my side, but lately he had started doing something strange every night around 2 a.m. Max would leave my side, go downstairs to the living room, and start barking at first. I thought he was just hearing noises from outside, maybe raccoons rummaging through garbage or stray cats prowling, but it became a pattern every single night. At the same time, he would bark at something. He never seemed scared, but he was alert, like he was warning someone or something to stay away. I tried to ignore it. Max would bark for a while and then come back my room, curling up on his bed like nothing had happened, but the barking made me uneasy. The nights felt colder, the silence in the house heavier, and I started to dread the sound of Max's claws clicking on the wooden floor as he headed downstairs one Friday night in cold December. I was in the living room trying to distract myself with a movie. Max was laying at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sounds from the TV. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 2 a.m. Right on cue, Max stood up, his ears perked, and walked to the door of the basement. He stared at it for a moment, then let out a low growl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and listened. Max started barking, loud, sharp barks that echoed through the house. He was standing near the basement door, his nose almost pressed against it. His body was tense, his tail stiff. He wasn't barking at nothing. He was focused like he saw something. I couldn't. I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table and slowly approached the basement door. My heart was racing and my hands felt clammy despite the cold. The air seemed heavier pressing down on me. As I opened the door just enough to shine the flashlight down the stairs, the beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cluttered basement. Old boxes, broken furniture, and a few tools were scattered around. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then just for a moment I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, quick and fleeting, moving behind the boxes. I froze, my mind raced with possibilities. Was it an animal? Could someone have broken in? I didn't know what to do. My instincts told me to run, but this was my house. I couldn't just ignore it. Instead of going down alone, I called my friend Luke. Luke was the kind of guy who never hesitated to help, and he was braver than I could ever hope to be. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh or brush it off. He just said he'd be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Max stayed by the basement door, barking and growling occasionally. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight tightly, jumping at every little noise. When Luke arrived, he didn't waste any time. Armed with his own flashlight, he gave me a reassuring nod, and we both headed toward the basement door. Max followed us, his tail wagging slightly. Now that Luke was here, we stepped into the basement, the wooden stair creaking under our weight. The air was damp and smelled of mildew. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing nothing. But as we moved closer to the corner behind a stack of boxes, we found him, a man. He was crouched on the floor, his arms wrapped around his knees, trembling. He looked thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. When our lights hit him, he flinched and held up his hands like he was afraid we'd hurt him. "Please," he said, his voice shaking, "don't call the police. I'm sorry. I'll leave." Luke and I exchanged glances, unsure what to do. The man started crying, his words piling out in a desperate rush. He told us he'd been living in the basement for weeks. He wasn't a criminal, he said. He was just homeless. His wife had died earlier that year and he'd lost everything, his home, his job, his hope. One cold night, he found my front door ajar and decided to sneak in just to find a place to sleep. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. "I only came out at night to get food from the kitchen. I'm sorry." His story hit me hard. I couldn't imagine the kind of pain He must have gone. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but I couldn't do it. He wasn't dangerous, he was just a man at the end of his rope. I told him he didn't have to sneak around anymore. Look, and I helped him upstairs. And I gave him some food and a warm blanket. He ate like he hadn't seen a meal in days. He kept apologizing, saying he would leave and never come back, but I couldn't just send him back into the cold. Instead, I gave him some money and drove him to a nearby shelter where he could get help. As I dropped him off, he looked at me with tears in his eyes and thanked me over and over. That night, I returned home exhausted but relieved. Max called up at my feet as I sat on the couch, the house finally quiet. I couldn't stop thinking about the man and how easily our lives could fall apart. Since that night, I always double check my doors before bed, but more than that, I have tried to hold on to a little more compassion. Sometimes people just need a little help to find their way again. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks. When I was young, I wanted to prove that I could live on my own. My parents thought I wasn't ready, but I wanted to show them I could handle it. I rented a small apartment through Airbnb. It was near, clean, and in a good area. At first, everything seemed perfect. I unpacked, set up my things, and began adjusting to living alone. But soon strange things started happening. I had a toddler, my little son Adam. He loved playing with his toys and talking a lot. Even though most of his words didn't make sense, yet one day I heard him laughing and talking in his room. I peeked in expecting to see him playing with his stuffed animals. Instead, he was sitting on the floor staring at a blank spot in the corner. His words weren't clear, but it sounded like he was having a full conversation. I asked him, "Who are you talking to?" He just pointed to the corner and said, "My dog Kay." I didn't think much of it at first. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the next day he started yelling in the same corner. His face was red with anger, as if he was arguing with someone I couldn't see. I couldn't get him to calm down. He kept pointing at the corner, shouting, "Bad. Go away." That night I woke up feeling strange. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It felt like a nightmare, but it was too real when I finally snapped out of it. I looked down at my arms and saw red marks, scratches running along my skin. The next few nights were worse. I would wake up gasping with more scratches and bruises appearing out of nowhere. I couldn't explain it. During the day, I worked the night shift with my mom in a government building. One night something happened that I will never forget. The building view had security cameras set up in the parking lot, and employees could watch the footage while waiting for my shift to start. I glanced at the monitors and froze. There on the screen was a large black shape near my car. It wasn't a person, it wasn't an animal, not really. It looked vaguely like a dog but had no clear features, just a dark, blurry outline. It stayed low to the ground, almost slinging as it moved. I watched it for a while, trying to convince myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the cameras. But then it crept closer to my car, circling it as if it was waiting for me. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to handle things myself to prove I wasn't scared. The next night it happened again. I saw the black figure on the cameras doing the same things, stalking around my car. It didn't seem to notice the other cars, only mine. When I went home that night, things felt different. The apartment was quiet, too quiet for the first time in weeks. I didn't wake up with scratches. It seemed like the figure had stayed behind at work. But I was wrong. My mom lived out in the countryside with my grandparents. Their house was about a quarter of a mile down the road from hers, and there was a shortcut through the woods that connected them. If you walked through the woods, it was about half a mile. The path was narrow and overgrown, and you couldn't take a car. It was only for walking. One evening, I decided to visit my mom. The sun was setting as I entered the woods. The air was cool, and the trees cast long shadows over the trail. It felt peaceful at first, but halfway through, I started to feel like I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. The woods can play tricks on you. The sounds of rustling leaves and snapping twigs seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it a low growl. It was a normal growl. It was deep, rumbling, and full of anger. My heart started pounding. As I turned to look behind me, there it was, the black figure from the parking lot. It stood at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the shadows. It didn't have eyes or face, but I could feel it staring at me. Its body seemed to ripple like smoke, shifting and moving even though it stayed in one place. I turned and started walking faster, but the growling grew louder. I could hear its heavy footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. It was following me. I didn't run. I knew if I ran, it would chase me. My chest felt tight, and every part of me screamed to get out of those woods. I kept walking, my legs shaking with every step. Then it let out a sound I'll never forget, a howl, but not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was long, deep, and full of rage. It made the trees around me feel smaller, like they were closing in. I knew in that moment that if it caught me, I wouldn't make it out alive somehow. I made it to my mom's house. I slammed the door behind me and locked it. My mom was startled, asking what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. I just said something's in the woods. She looked at me with wide eyes and said, I've seen it too. She told me about the black figure she'd seen on the cameras at work. I realized then that it wasn't just my imagination. Whatever it was, it had followed me home for weeks. I stayed with my mom, afraid to go back to my apartment. Eventually, the scratches stopped and the nightmare faded. When I was in college, I shared a small off campus apartment with my best friend, Jamie. We were both a little odd, preferring quiet nights and weird adventures over the usual party scene. One cold October night, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was past 2 a.m. and the streets were silent except for the occasional rustles of leaves. We weren't drunk or anything, just bored and restless, looking for something to do. As we wandered past a stretch of dimly lit shops, we sighted a dog laying in the gutter. It was a large black dog, its fur matted and dull, its body was stiff if the way animals get after death. There was a dark, greasy smear under its head, and it didn't take much imagination to guess it had been hit by a car. Jamie knelt beside it for a moment, shaking his head. Poor thing, he muttered. We didn't stay long. The sight was unsettling, and there was nothing we could do. We kept walking, eventually reaching a small park a few blocks away. The swings swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking softly, and the street light cast long eerie shadows on the path. We sat on the bench for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, just enjoying the quiet. After about an hour, we decided to head back the way we came. As we approached the stretch of road where we had seen the dog, a car passed by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. That's when we saw it again, the same black dog, alive, crossing the street away from us. It moved slowly, almost limping, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. Under the streetlight, Jamie froze mid-step. Did you see that? I nodded, my mouth dry. We hurried back to the spot where we had first seen it, expecting to find the body still there. But the gutter was empty. The greasy smear remained dark and glistening, but the dog was gone. We didn't say much as we walked back to our apartment. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was watching us. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself we must have seen mistaken. Maybe the dog hadn't been dead. After all, maybe it had been stunned and somehow managed to get up and walk away, but it didn't make sense. Its body had been stiff. It wasn't breathing. That was only the beginning. A few nights later, Jamie was out with a friend, and I was alone in the apartment trying to study. The building was old with thin walls and creaky floors, so I was used to hearing strange noises, but that night it felt different. I kept hearing faint scratching at the window, like claws dragging against the glass. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a tree branch, but when I looked outside, there was nothing. There just the empty street, dimly lit by the orange glow of the street lights. I closed the blinds and tried to ignore it, but the scratching continued, soft but persistent. It wasn't until Jamie came home that it finally stopped. Anything weird happened? I was out, he asked, tossing his jacket on the couch. I hesitated, then shook my head. No, nothing. I didn't want to sound crazy, but over the next few weeks, the dog started appearing more and more. Jimmy and his friend were walking home from a bar one night when they saw it chase them down the street. Another time, I saw it sitting under a street light across from our apartment. its eyes reflecting the light in an unnatural way. It didn't move, didn't bark, just sat there watching. We started hearing rumors too. One of our neighbors mentioned seeing a black dog roaming the area. Late at night, our Ra even left us a note asking to speak with us. When we knocked on her door, she led us back to our apartment without explanation. When we got there, she opened the door, looked around at the mess, pizza boxes, laundry, half empty cups of coffee, and frowned there. No way, you are keeping a dog in here. Sorry, Jamie and I exchanged a look. We don't have a dog, he said slowly. Dero raised an eyebrow. One of the groundskeepers said they saw a black dog in your window the other night. We didn't argue. What could we say? We just nodded, waited for her to leave, and locked the door behind her. The final straw came one night in November. Jimmy and I were both in the apartment, sitting on the couch, when we heard it a low guttural growl coming from somewhere. Just outside the window, my stomach dropped. Jamie stood up, his face pale. Stay here. He grabbed a flashlight and headed to the window. Slowly, he pulled back the blinds just enough to peek outside. He froze, his body stiffening like he'd been turned to stone. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, letting the blinds fall shut, and turned to me. It's out there, he said, his voice shaking. It's just standing there, staring at the window. We didn't sleep that night. We kept all the lights on and stayed in the living room, jumping at every little sound. By morning, the dog was gone, but the unease lingered. Jamie moved out a few weeks later, claiming he wouldn't take the weirdness anymore. I stayed until the end of the semester, but I never felt comfortable in that apartment again.